All right. Kim, are we ready? Okay. We are maximizing social distancing this evening.
Hello. How are you doing, Clint?
All right. Kim, are we ready? All right. So, wow. This is a little small, but that's okay. This is more of a closer setting than what we've got. But appreciate those of you that are joining us online. You probably are going to quickly outnumber those of us that are here. So we are going to be in Lamentations to start off. If you would like to turn over there, that's where we're going to kick things off. We are in this time period where within Judah, we've seen everything fall apart. And then over the last few weeks, we've watched kind of how that eventually all unfolds, leading to the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem in particular. And then what we've done is kind of walked through all phases of the destruction of Judah. And so there are actually 3 points where Babylon comes and removes people from Judah. We saw all of that, and now we're kind of going sort of backwards a little bit during that same time period after the original defeat. And so Lamentations is after things occur after the destruction of Jerusalem, is my understanding. But then Ezekiel is kind of all during this time period after the captivity has started, but the final destruction of Jerusalem and Judah has not taken place. So we'll get into a little bit of that as we go along. But what I wanted to do is just basically kind of give a walkthrough of Lamentations and a walkthrough of Ezekiel and kind of just go from there. So with that being said, Lamentations is obviously a fairly short book, only 5 chapters if you read it this last week. And it is a lament. It is a book of mourning, and so there's a lot of sadness. There's not a lot of hope in the book itself. There's only, in fact, kind of just a couple of sections that deal with that. But one of the things that I did not know, and I saw this on the Bible Project's video for the book, we obviously, I guess I'm assuming nobody else, I'm assuming everybody else doesn't speak Hebrew. And so one of the things that you find out when you look at the makeup of the book, you'll notice if you look in the chapters, chapter 1 is 22 verses, chapter 2 is 22 verses, chapter 3 is 66 verses, chapter 4 is 22 verses, chapter 5 is 22 verses. I believe the last one's 22. The reason being is the book itself is an acrostic. And so all of the verses start with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it goes from beginning to end in chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 4. Chapter 5 is not that way, and chapter 3 is actually 3 verses per letter. So 3 times the same one. Now, totally oblivious to us. We don't, there's nothing in the English that you're like, oh, I see it. No, I don't see it at all in the English. But supposedly from people who know way more than I do, that's what's happening. So we're just going to trust them on that. And so basically there's a lot of richness to this that we miss out on because we don't know the Hebrew. But the reality is that it's good that it still makes sense. So we don't need that to necessarily understand what's going on. So obviously it's a book of mourning. When you read through Lamentations, what's the general focus of the book outside of just the mourning as the overarching point? Anything in particular jump out to you guys? So one of the things that I think when you walk through the book, you see, everything falls apart, and there's just the mourning of the destruction of Jerusalem. There's God striking them down with all kinds of anger. You look at chapter 2, the Lord, kind of the heading in my reads, the Lord is destroyed without pity. And so you've got this very sad story, and Cassie in his commentary brought up that they believe Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations, though the text does not say anything. And if he is the one who wrote it, who better to know what it was like than Jeremiah, who actually lived through all of this? He was there when every part of this happened. And so it's a very much in that regard, almost a first-hand account, though it's not a historical document like that. He's not relating the specifics of everything, but he would have been there, would have witnessed it all, and so it would have been obviously very much on his heart, what he saw, what he felt in this process. I wanted to ask this question in thinking about this. When we read, and Dave sent out some stuff about Nigeria to us today, when we read about things that are happening outside of our own situation, what makes it hard to empathize or to sympathize or to feel when we read those things? What makes that challenging? Okay, we're not there, right? And there's something about being close to something that does make a difference. Whether it's not right, but there is something about being close. What else? Why is it hard to...
The emotional aspect is not the same because since we're not experiencing it or near it, there's not as much emotion. So we look at it a little bit differently when there's no emotion.
Yeah, so when we think about events that happen in life, when we experience that, we feel with the person who is also experiencing that. Or if we've experienced it in the past, we feel for the person who is now going through what we've already gone through. But for all of us, right, when the first time we've encountered something, we realized I didn't understand it before. I didn't get how hard it was, whatever the thing was. And so when we don't have that experience to pull from, sometimes we kind of can be a little bit, I don't want to say hard-hearted, but we don't feel quite as much. I think as well, when you consider, when we're able to find commonalities between us, and so like Nigeria, it's kind of hard because we don't even have, just other than videos, we have no clue what it's like to live in Nigeria. We know it's challenging, but when we see, well, they're Christians. Okay, well, there's a feel there because we are connected in that way. But even then, it's still very different. When you think about somebody who has your job, or who has the same number of kids that you have, or who has they live in the same place that you do. Those are connections that tend to draw out a little more of an emotional response. Now, I bring all this up to say, you read a book like Lamentations, and we read it as history. We read it as just a document. But this would have been an emotionally exhausting thing, I think, for a Jewish person to read. Because it's recounting some of the worst things. Again, it's not the same because our America is not the same thing as Judah was, but it would be like being in the destroyed America after it's destroyed, recounting that. It would not just be, that was interesting. There would be an emotional attachment to it. And so it's hard for us to do that, I think, when we read some of these texts. But obviously, this was a big deal. What I do like about it, if you want to go to chapter 1, I'm going to look at a couple of verses. What I like about this is, I'm just going to say Jeremiah wrote this based on what we believe historically. Jeremiah, there's no sugarcoating what happened, and there's no denying why. So much of these things that we've looked at with the people of Israel and Judah, it's like, well, why are you doing this, God? And of course, we know why, but they don't always say that. But in chapter 1, verses 8 and 18, it says this, Jerusalem sinned grievously. Therefore, she became filthy. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. Verse 18. The Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against his word. But hear, all you peoples, and see my suffering. My young women and my young men have gone into captivity. What do they understand? At least, what does the writer of this understand? Why is all this happening? Yeah, this is what they deserved it. And I think it's really interesting the way that verse 18 starts. The Lord is in the right. That's not how we tend to respond. How often is someone disciplined and they say, you were right to do that? We don't do that, but that's what they did. That's what he says. God is in the right. This is horrible. The whole book is a lament about what has happened, yet he also declares God's in the right because of what we have done. Now, obviously, we don't like that. We don't like that at all, but that's the reality. When you look through, I want you to go to chapter 2, verse 14. One of the things that we've seen consistently throughout our Old Testament reading is one of the problems for God's people is that they're receiving mixed messages. Not from God, but just in general. And we've seen this before, and in chapter 2, verse 14, it says this. Your prophets have seen for you false and deceptive visions. They have not exposed your iniquity to restore your fortunes, but have seen for you oracles that are false and misleading. And so we know that God has sent Jeremiah, and before that Isaiah, and now later on we'll see Ezekiel. He's sent these prophets, and they're preaching a message of destruction and all kinds of things. And yet at the very same time, there are also other quote-unquote prophets preaching the exact opposite message. And what is laid out here is they were all false, right? And God had told them, you'll know which one's right and which one's wrong by whether or not it happens. And yet they continually buy into the false prophecies And we talked, I think, about this maybe a little bit last week or week before, and it makes sense why. I mean, they're telling them a message that they want to hear. What I wanted to think about for us, as just by way of application, how do we as Christians grow or become better at listening to messages that we don't want to hear? Because that's what they continue to buy into these lies because it fed what they wanted the ultimate outcome to be. So how do we do that? How do we have hearts that are willing to listen to things that we don't actually like? Mike?
I'd say this particularly applies to people who were maybe more in the world than before coming to Christ.
Sure.
But your mind gets opened because of mistakes you've made. Not to say people who were raised in the church don't make
Sure.
mistakes. But, mistakes are some of the best lessons you can learn. You said, kind of what they're going through right here. They're seeing the negative outcome of what they did, and that happens in our lives as well. We look back and say, if I just did what God told me to, that wouldn't happen.
Yeah. Sometimes there's that moment, right, when we recognize, well, that was me. I mean, I did the wrong thing there. I knew what I should have done, or somebody else had made it clear, and I didn't listen. And then that's the I don't want to say it's the worst case, because the worst case would be not ever listening at all. But that's one of the ones you say, I don't want to do that all the time, because that tends to go poorly in the moment. I mean, that means I'm kind of playing catch up, trying to fix things after I've messed them up, which is helpful. I mean, it's better to recognize it than not. But right, and that is the thing, and that's going back to the sympathy, empathy for the. We tend to respond better, right, when we've actually experienced the reason why we're in trouble, why we're having the problem. We tend to listen a little better after that than we do before. What else might help us in having a willingness to listen to a message that we may not like?
I think there's an aspect of humility, just that we don't have our whole act together. God is right. He's righteous. His word is true. And no matter how I fight against it, there's an aspect of, it is what it is. I'm going to trust God.
Yeah, there is. That was one of the words I thought of, was the word humility. Is if you're going to listen to something, you have to be willing to admit that you don't have every answer, and maybe you're not right, and I might have to change my perspective or my mind, or I might need to learn something here. Definitely a lack of pride or arrogance in our own situation here.
Well, knowing that God has instructed us or guided us in the best for us, if we obey Him and what He's teaching us, we, in our mind, we may not like it because it's a battle of will, but in the heart of hearts, I think we know that, well, God wouldn't, He's not trying to be evil. He wants the best for us. So you put things in that perspective and you go, well, this is good for me.
Yeah, and we're gonna get to that idea in just a second. That specific idea of God being good. One of the other things that I thought of was truth. We want to be those who seek truth, who are known for seeking truth. If you're someone who your concern is truth, then you're willing to listen to things that you don't agree with, or you may not like on first hearing, because you say, well, I got to know. I want to know whether this is right or not, and so we dig. And so that's one of the things as well. Go over to chapter 3 and look down at verse 21. We'll kind of dig into something here that Gary kind of brought up. I want to read a couple of comments from online. Chuck said, we don't always have sympathy for those who the Lord says were evil and were punished. Of course, we would not feel that way if it was us. And God grieves over the rebellious, and so should we. And that's absolutely true. It's easier to look at some of these situations that are going on and think, well, they deserve that, or they earned that, and not really have much sympathy, like we talked about earlier. And then Rudy said, by putting yourself in someone's shoes and their feelings, that's, again, one of the things to help us kind of work through some of those ideas, is getting that other perspective. Empathy, sympathy comes from that idea. All right, so in chapter 3, we've got this section of hope. And again, the book is not one, if you want to say, oh, I need some encouragement today, you're not going to go to Lamentations. That's not the place that you're going to go. If you do happen to find yourself in Lamentations needing encouragement, there's one place that you will go, and that's chapter 3, verses 21 and following. So I'm just going to read a part of this real quick. It says, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone in silence when it is laid on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes, and let him be filled with insults. For the Lord will not cast off forever. But though he cause grief, he will have compassion, according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not afflict from his heart, or grieve the children of men. And so you've got this section, and we sing a song from this part of Lamentations. But you've got several ideas here, and one of them connects with what we've been talking about up to this point and some of the other things we've been dealing with about the character of God. Nancy?
By the way, that lady who wrote that song was going to Church of Christ.
Oh, I did not know that. It helps when I would be able to maybe, if I could take like one song, I might be able to figure out a way to make music out of that, but otherwise I'm totally worthless. So some of these, what I find funny is once you learn the song, it's like you read it and you're trying not to sing it while you read it, which is fun. But so one of the things that we see here is the character of God. That's what he falls back on. And we talked about this before. But notice in verse 22, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. It's the character of God. It's not based upon, okay, God has promised me he's going to fix my problems, or that God is going to not let his people fall in the case of Jerusalem, which he did allow. But it's that God is faithful and that God is merciful. Those are the things that Jeremiah here points to as the reasons why he's trusting God. And to Gary's point earlier about God is good, he says in verse 25, the Lord is good to those who wait for him. Now remember, this is after all of these awful things have happened to Judah and Jerusalem, and yet he still declares here that the Lord is good. And again, that's not because he looks at the horror of what's happened to Jerusalem and says God is good because he's done that, but it's because of the character of God, who he is, and what he is like. And so I think there's some value in some of these kinds of things where we just see this is the nature of our God. This is the character that he has, and we trust him. We focus in on him because of the character, not because we understand everything that's going on. Any other thoughts from that section? Yeah, Mike?
I like the latter half of that where it talks, where in 27, it is good for him that he bear the yoke in his youth. Basically saying, it's better to learn these lessons when you're young because then you've got a whole life to put them into practice. And I wonder if there's some deeper application here for the church. Learn these lessons now because you think about learning in your youth, you've got your whole life ahead of you. Well, the church has its whole life ahead of it. And maybe this was
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely wisdom there in what is being said about the fact that it is better, far better. That's right, and that's what that's why if you have kids, that's what you're trying to do well in advance of their getting to be adults, is teach those things so that they don't have to make those same things. And yeah, on a corporate, corporate's not the best word maybe, but the whole church setting would be as well. Gary?
One of the things I thought of reading Lamentations was that Jeremiah knew, because God told him what was going to happen. I wondered if Lamentations got written after he saw it happen. And, then there's this impact, because prophesying and believing that God means what he says, but trying to imagine what that means. Evil, wicked people coming in and just doing their evil, wicked things. Seeing the temple destroyed, Jerusalem devastated, and the people killed and tortured. Some of you don't even know what happened to them, but
Right.
I can't imagine that seeing that was just way more impactful than prophesying about it.
Yeah, there's definitely, again, when you read some of the historical aspects of what goes on, it's really just, that's what it is. But it's intense what happens here. And so it's not shocking to find this kind of book after those events and the emotion that's packed into it. One of the other things that I found interesting was in verse 40. After that section we just looked at, he says this, let us test and examine our ways and return to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts and hands to God in heaven. We have transgressed and rebelled, and you have not forgiven. You know, you think about when bad things happen, we tend to flee whoever caused us the harm. And God made it abundantly clear he was bringing destruction on them. And yet Jeremiah's response is not get away from God, but it's actually turn back to God, because you were going away, and that's what caused the problem. Turn around. Repent is the word that we would use. And so throughout this whole Old Testament study, that's what we've continually seen, is they were supposed to trust in God's character, which we just saw, and then repent when they went the wrong way. Turn. Go back to God, and God will respond to that. Unfortunately, they didn't. And they continued down this path, and we're here to this point that we're at right now in Lamentations. Rudy said, no matter what, we must always trust the Lord. And that's what they were supposed to learn through all of these miracles and all of these situations, was just trust God. And it never sunk in enough to stick long term. Dave?
You know, I have a favorite verse in Hosea 12:6 says, but you must return to your God, maintain love and justice, and wait for your God always. And that ties in a lot with what Lamentation was saying today.
Yeah, very, very similar ideas present about waiting for God in particular. Mike?
And I think 42, where it talks about we have not been forgiven, that's not what we think of as Christians as forgiven from sins and, restored or anything. Because if you make that argument, that means Jeremiah,
Oh, sure.
is not in heaven and received his reward. I think that's reflecting how us as humans think God should forgive us without taking the view of God will forgive us in his ways. In other words, just a lightening of our burden does not mean that we are, not being blessed by God.
Yeah, look at verse 42, and we'll keep rolling. It says, we have transgressed and rebelled, and you have not forgiven. You have wrapped yourself with anger and pursued us, killing without pity. You have wrapped yourself with a cloud so that no prayer can pass through. You have made us scum and garbage among the peoples. You look at the idea here, and one of the things that jumps out to me is we have done wrong, and you didn't forgive. You punished. You punished us, and they're in this situation because God didn't say no big deal. They're in this situation because God said no. It is a big deal, and we have transgressed, we have rebelled, and your anger has been demonstrated from what we have done.
Another way of saying that may be our language is not you didn't forgive, but you didn't relent.
That's when I go from 42 into the next section. That's what it makes me think. I could be wrong on that, but that's what it makes me think. Is God didn't, up to this point, over and over, God has given him more time, and not anymore. I mean, that was it. They rebelled, and they were done. And again, what we've read over the last few weeks is the conclusion of that fact. Maybe there might be more to it than that. That's something that comes to my mind connecting those verses. All right, let's go over to Ezekiel. So just a couple of pages away. So if you're like me, and I don't know, some people really like Ezekiel-like books. I struggle. I am not an imagery kind of person. It just does not. My wife knows well. I'm a literalist. I'm reading about things, and I'm envisioning this literally, and what does that mean? And it doesn't work well for me, so I have to get a lot of help in reading some of this. But I'm not super familiar with Ezekiel until reading it this last week. And I start off in chapter 1. I'm like, oh man, this is going to be a tough book because it's winged creatures with eyes and wheels and all kinds of stuff. And I'm thinking, okay, all right, here we go. So after reading it and doing some more study, I'm feeling a little bit more comfortable with the book itself. But Ezekiel is, as I said, written after not the complete destruction of Jerusalem, but after it's been defeated. So my understanding from reading some different things, I don't remember what I was looking at today to confirm this. Maybe it was Cassie's commentary. But in 606, there's a group taken into exile, and Daniel is a part of that group. And then I believe it's in 597, I think. There's a second group then taken into exile. Ezekiel is supposedly a part of that group. And so he's taken into exile, so when we meet him, he's not in Jerusalem. He's not in Judah. He's in Babylon. and it gives us specific, the Chabar now, I think, is the area. But he's prophesying about Judah and Jerusalem, even though he's not actually there, because there still are people there at this point. It's not been completely destroyed. This all takes place during the reign of a guy named Zedekiah, the last king he's put in place by Nebuchadnezzar after Jehoiachin, the rightful king of Judah, is taken off into captivity in the first go-around. So all of that being said, Ezekiel is a priest who is in exile, and God appears to him and gives him these visions. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to walk through just kind of what happens in the section that we read. I don't have a lot of application stuff, but just kind of walk through some of what happens, and if you have comments or questions, feel free to throw them out. But chapters 1 through 3 and then chapters 8 through 11 both involve visions that Ezekiel has. And in reading this, there's definitely some Revelation-esque components to it. And so you've got living creatures, which are similarly in Revelation. There's some differences between them, but there's obviously the ideas are very similar. You've got the idea of eating a scroll that's in both of the books as well. You've got the picture of God in Revelations. You've got pictures of Jesus and of God that are, descriptive of blinding light and things of that sort. So in reading this, I got a lot of help from Jim McGuigan's commentary on kind of understanding this. So in chapter 1, there's this vision that appears where there's this storm, there's lightning and fire going on, and he sees these 4 living creatures. And in watching a video from the Bible Project, I was able to mentally picture this. McGuigan describes this as a chariot. God's chariot is what he calls it. But basically, imagine these 4 creatures. They have 4 wings. 2 of them are covering their bodies, and then the other 2 are outstretched. And if you imagine them in a box, basically, imagine them on 4 corners, and the wings of each ones are touching the wings of the other ones on the corners, then you have basically a box-like structure. Wheels next to each of these 4 living creatures, eyes all over the wheels, and then you also have these faces on these 4 living creatures that are a human, an ox, an eagle, and a lion. And there's this imagery of these. They don't actually move. They move, but they don't. Their heads don't turn, anything like that. They can go anywhere, and I think Zach brought this up in his video last week, but there's this idea of just God being able to move anywhere, see anything, that kind of idea. And on top of or over these living creatures is a throne. And much like we see throughout the rest of Scripture, there is a description of God, but it's not a description that, we would say is a complete description. There's just, it's if you look down in verse, let's see here, verse 26. And above the expanse over their heads there was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of a throne was the likeness with a human appearance. And upward from what had the appearance of his waist I saw as it were gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist I saw as it were the appearance of fire, and there was brightness around him, like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of rain. So was the appearance of the brightness all around. And so, we wouldn't describe a person that way. This is a description given of God, of this metal and fire, and there's rainbow colors going on. It's very interesting imagery here. But the whole idea seems to be this is just God's presence. The glory of God is on display in the face of Ezekiel, if you will. And these creatures and this throne and everything appears again in chapters 8 through 11. But in the first section, you've got the commissioning, basically, of Ezekiel. He sees all of this, and then he's told to eat this scroll and go to the people and preach to them, essentially. If you remember, what is God's message to Ezekiel about the effectiveness of his ministry? What does he kind of go into this knowing is going to happen? Strong response from the people or no response from the people? No response. I mean, they're not going to say, Ezekiel, this is the message that we needed. They're going to be like the previous people. They're going to not listen. There's not going to be a strong response to it. And again, I don't know if it's meant to be humorous. I find it a little bit humorous here. But it says, let's see if I can find it. I didn't plan on bringing this part up. It says, verse 7 of chapter 3, but the house of Israel will not be willing to listen to you, for they are not willing to listen to me, because all of the house of Israel have a hard forehead and a stubborn heart. Behold, I have made your face as hard as their faces, and your forehead as hard as their foreheads. Basically, he says, they're going to be stubborn, and I'm going to make you just as stubborn in preaching this message to them. And so God makes it clear to Ezekiel, they're not going to listen, but you're going to be able to do what I'm asking you to do. I'm going to make you as stubborn as they are, as hard, if you will, as they are from your end of things. And so, obviously, that's a tough calling to be placed in, to know that, and yet that's what he does. Nancy?
So was he preached to the people that are already in exile, or is he preaching to the people that are still in Jerusalem?
So my understanding, and again, this is the kind of book that I struggle with understanding, so I might be wrong. But my understanding, he's in exile. At one point, he has a vision of going to Jerusalem and seeing some things, but my understanding is it's all to the people that were already in exile. And so that's my understanding. Again, I might be wrong on that, but that's the conclusion I reached in looking at this. So anyway, in chapter, I believe it's chapter 3, eventually God says, you're to be a watchman. I'm putting you out here to tell the people when they're wrong, you need to tell them that. And if you don't, you're responsible for that. And so there's that section that we might be familiar with. Then if you go to chapter 8 through chapter 11, you've got him going to the temple, again, in this vision. And he goes to the temple and he sees all of these horrible things happening. Right? There's an idol outside of the temple. There are people worshiping idols in the temple. There are women outside weeping over a different god. And then there are people outside the temple with their backs to the temple worshiping the sun. There's just all of this imagery and ideas of God's people they're idolatrous. They're absolutely, totally away from God. And then in chapter 9, there's destruction brought out onto the people. And I want you to think about this. Let's see here. Chapter 9, verse 4. And the Lord said to him, there's a gentleman with wearing linen and having this ability to mark people. It says, pass through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it. And to the others he said in my hearing, pass through the city after him and strike. Your eye shall not spare, and you shall not show pity. When I read this, I almost thought of in the Exodus, where the angel of death goes through, and there are some that are marked, if you will, through the Passover, through the Lamb, that are saved, that are spared, and the rest are not, the firstborn there. You get this idea of destruction upon a certain group of people, and again, this is this imagery being used here. And then, I don't know what your heading says for chapter 10, but mine says, the glory of the Lord leaves the temple. And by the end of the chapter, and on to chapter 11, essentially God's presence is leaving the temple. Now, why is that a big deal? Now, we might read that and say, well, okay, but why is that so significant?
It's leaving his people. Because that's where God dwells for us, in a sense.
Yeah, when you think about their understanding, right, they built the temple knowing that God is beyond being housed in the temple, but that's where the presence of God was in a unique way. And now that he's leaving, you want to talk about a way to know that God has left? That's the fullest indication that you can give, Mike.
People are no longer special. They're not protected.
Yeah, and because you think about from the Exodus time period onward, what had always been with the people? The presence of God, right? Whether you're talking about the pillar of fire or the pillar of cloud as they traveled, then you've got the presence of God going into the temple itself and dwelling there, and now it's gone. It's left because of all of their sin and all of the things that they have done. And so the picture given here in this vision is of God leaving his people because of what has happened. See, Chuck said, Ezekiel is told to tell them all the punishment that is coming, even though they will not listen. If he doesn't, their blood will be on Ezekiel. If he speaks for God, their blood is on their own heads. And that's ultimately part of what motivates, it seems like, Ezekiel to go and do this, is that I'm making you responsible for this, is basically what God lays out for him. And so you've got these two visions that, again, that was I don't know if you read that, you say, I have no idea what's happening. Well, you're in good company because it's just tough. But there are some things that you can kind of piece together to understand what is going on. Mike?
We may not exactly understand what these visions mean, but we can say with confidence it doesn't matter what you see late night on the History Channel. This is not aliens in the Bible.
Right, right. There are some things that you can look at and say, there's some crazy theories, right? And, every once in a while we'll get some interesting mail from people here at the church. And not from people at the church, but some other people outside that send us mail about things that are going to happen. And, the moment I pick anything up and all of a sudden there's random verses from Ezekiel thrown in, I'm thinking, all right, probably not going to keep reading this, because there are tons of things that people take from these very imagery-associated ideas and just come up with all kinds of crazy ideas. When you read some of it, it doesn't all make perfect sense to us. At least it doesn't to me. But there are things that we can conclude. And aliens would be one of those that we could not conclude. Or we can conclusively say is not what the text is talking about. Now, what's interesting with Ezekiel, right, is so you have these visions that, again, are Revelation-esque. And then you also have Ezekiel kind of similar to Jeremiah as this prophet who uses all kinds of illustrations in his preaching. And so he's not just declaring messages, but he is creating situations that teach something. And so I'll just quickly skim through them. If you start in chapter 4, there's 3 different ones in chapter 4. So you've got, he makes this model city of Jerusalem, and God says, make this model city and then besiege it. Build siege ramps up to it. He asks him to take this piece of metal, like this griddle, and kind of move towards the city. Kind of this ominous destruction is coming. And so, again, I think it was maybe the Bible Project video I was watching, but, you can imagine, people are watching Ezekiel's building this little area, and he's besieging it, and it's like, what's happening? Well, he's showing what's going to happen, right? And in the very next section, God tells him, I want you to, verses 4 down through verse 8, you're going to lie on your side for 390 days on your left side, 40 days on your right side, to be for the number of years of punishment for God's people. Well, that's kind of crazy. And then he keeps going. He says, then you're going to make this bread that today people call Ezekiel bread, but it's made out of wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and emmer, whatever emmer is, and bake this thing to eat, and to not eat very much and to not drink very much. And then he's got to cook it over, originally God says human poop is what he's going to have to cook it over. And he says, God, I've never done anything like I've not done anything to make myself unclean. And so God says, okay, you can cook it over animal poop and eat it that way. And that's what happens. And so you've got this idea of maybe uncleanness, maybe famine, or during the siege, not having food. But there's this idea of a food issue. Then in chapter 5, he has him cut all his hair off. And he takes a third of the hair and he burns it up to describe destruction, and then he slices up a lot of it to describe the destruction in that way, and then he takes some of it and he throws it up and he slices that up as destruction as they're fleeing, and he saves a little bit and he burns the rest. And there's all of this, again, just imagine watching this. You think, what is he doing? Well, he's laying out, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen to God's people. They're going to be destroyed. And so he uses this very intense illustration of his own person, if you will, to do that. And then in chapter 12, God tells him to dig through a wall and to carry his belongings with him as if he is going into exile, to show that God's people are going to go into exile. And so he uses a lot of these, in-your-face, action-oriented illustrations to prove some sort of a teaching that God is trying to give the people. Dave?
But there's been already 2 exiles before this. And so is this exile he's talking about like the final one at Jerusalem?
Yes. This is the one that comes next is the last one that there is. In 586, I think, is the final one. That's the last one. That's the one he's talking about here. And so you've got all of this. Again, Ezekiel's it's a very interesting book because you've got the visions, and then you have these very odd, at least to us, they seem odd illustrations that he he does on the part of for God. One of the things I wanted to draw attention to was chapter 14. I got a text from somebody this morning about this, so I wanted to hit on it. Chapter 14, we'll do this and one more thing and then we'll be done. Chapter 14, let's start down in verse 12. It says, "And the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, when a land sins against me by acting faithlessly, and I stretch out my hand against it and break its supply of bread and send famine upon it and cut off from it man and beast, even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they would deliver, but their own lives by their righteousness, declares the Lord God." And he goes on to talk about this in several ways, but he basically says, because of how sinful my people are, even if these righteous men like Job and Daniel and Noah lived here, they would get out, but nobody else would. You know, it's reminiscent of Noah, right? Where Noah and his family were delivered, but nobody else was. God is basically saying they've gotten so corrupt and so bad that it made me think as well as when Abraham and God have that conversation about Sodom, you know, where Abraham's kind of bargaining with God. What about if there are 40 people, or there 35 righteous, 30 righteous? And he gets all the way down to 10, and God still destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. And this is as if God is saying, there are only a few righteous. And even if these most righteous of people were there, I still wouldn't spare the city or the people because of the sin that they have committed. But somebody asked me, is this Daniel like the Daniel that we know? Because how does the time frame work here? And so I did a little research, and obviously, as with anything in Scripture, there's a lot of debate. Depending on which people you read from, there's debate on who this guy is. But just by way of how it's possible that it is the Daniel of the Old Testament, I'll just share this. So Daniel would have been taken into exile roughly 10 years before Ezekiel. And if we assume that the book of Daniel, which we haven't read yet for our Old Testament study, but if we assume that the events that take place at the beginning of the book are relatively, quickly after Daniel gets there, he's a teenage, younger man at that point. And what's the very first thing that we see from Daniel in the book of Daniel, as far as about his character? What does he do?
Eating?
Right.
Diet stuff.
Right. So the king is, going to feed him up well, and he says, well, we're not going to eat that. And there's that whole thing where, he trusts God. They only eat certain things, and the guy says, well, I'll give you, I think it's like a week or 10 days. If you don't look worse than the other guys, then I'll let you keep doing this. And so by the time Ezekiel begins his ministry, and even beyond that, we're talking about 10, 15 years at this point. So it's possible that Daniel is well known among the exiles as being a righteous man because he's with Nebuchadnezzar as one of the king's advisors, and he's not bowing down to the Gentile way of life. He's not eating the things that Jewish people aren't supposed to eat. So it's possible that they would have known about him at this point. It's not that he, again, some of the lion's den and some of those kind. I mean, that's later on, and it'd be hard for me to figure out timeline-wise how that point they would know him from that. But if you take the first part of the book of Daniel, it's possible that people knew that other Jews knew that he was willing to stand firm in what he believed was right in the sight of God. So that's one way, I think, to say why he would have used Daniel as an example there. But again, he doesn't tell us anything. He just uses Daniel as the illustration about the wickedness of the people versus the righteousness of a few. The last two things I'll mention are from chapter 15 and 16. There are a couple of I think I saw someone use the word parable, but there's these stories used to describe God's people. In chapter 15, there's the idea of a vine that's doing nothing. It's a worthless vine. It's not good for anything at all, and so it's going to be burned up. And essentially, that's kind of what God's people were at that point. And then chapter 16 involves this idea that God raises up Judah, Israel, raises up his people, cares for them, it marries them, does everything right for them, and like an unfaithful wife, they run off after others. And he even goes as far as to say it's not just that she, prostituted herself, but she actually paid others to be a prostitute with them. And so going much further than just she was unfaithful, but she continued to be unfaithful and sought out other people to be unfaithful. And if you keep reading down towards the end of chapter 16, he goes as far as to even say that they're worse than Sodom and even Israel. And so God makes it very clear his view as to where things are with his people, very strongly against the actions that they have taken. And so, again, Zach's teaching next Wednesday night. I'm going to be gone, but so hopefully he knows how the rest of the book works better than I do, because this was a lot more study and digging in than some of the other stuff I'm more familiar with. But there's a lot of stuff in here. When you can unpack it, it's kind of hard to unpack at times. Any comments on Ezekiel? I know we went through that really fast, but any comments on Ezekiel before we wrap up? So one other thing I wanted to mention from Ezekiel, and then we'll be done, is one of the phrases that's used quite a bit in Ezekiel is the phrase, the Son of Man. And that's a phrase where when you go into the Gospels, that's used often of Jesus as well. And so this is one of those moments where we see kind of Jesus taking an idea and applying it to himself, a very similar idea to the one given to Ezekiel here as the Son of Man. So some connections there with our New Testament studies. Okay. Well, appreciate those that are here, and appreciate those of you that joined us online. Next week, I believe, is only Ezekiel. Ezekiel 17 through 36, I think, is the reading. So with all of that being said, we'll go ahead and cut our live stream, and we'll go into a time of prayer.